The title of this session is Service Animals in the Workplace. If you are blind, you might use a guide dog to help you move through your neighborhood. If you are deaf, you might have a service dog to alert you to the telephone, fire alarms, or the doorbell. If you are paralyzed, you might have a service dog who is trained to open doors and drawers or even pick up things that get dropped. Your service animal may not even be a dog. How will employers accommodate the needs of persons who use service animals? How can a service animal be led into the workplace? These are the types of questions addressed by the Job Accommodation Network, JAN, http://www.askjan.org, located in West Virginia. You can click the box on stage to get a landmark to Jan's office in Second Life and a note card with information about the many accommodations-related services they provide. Our presenter this afternoon is Teresa. She is a senior consultant on the motor sensory team at JAN. She talks with both employer and employees about their rights and responsibilities under the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA. She helps them identify accommodation solutions for employees with motor impairment. We'd like to request that you hold your questions and comments for Jan until she has finished presenting, please. Please type question at the beginning of your question so it is easier to find in the chat stream. Jan always brings us helpful and interesting information, so let's.
Thank you, Auntie Lockjaw. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Service Animals in the Workplace. I'm Teresa Goddard, and I'm a senior consultant at the Job Accommodation Network. I'm on Jan's sensory team, which takes questions on accommodating individuals with sensory impairments, such as those involving hearing and vision, as well as other conditions, including communication disorders, allergies, and diabetes. I'd like to thank Gentle Heron and Virtual Ability for inviting Jan to be a part of today's event. I love to talk about service animals, and I'm very, very happy to be with you here today. First, I'd like to talk a little bit about the Job Accommodation Network. For those who may not know, JAN has been around for quite a while. JAN was established in 1983 as a national free service. At JAN, we specialize in providing information about job accommodations and about the employment provisions of the ADA. As most of you probably know, the ADA has more than one title, and the employment provisions of the ADA can be found in Title I. That's what we specialize in at the Job Accommodation Network. However, people often contact us with questions about other parts of the ADA, and we do our best to provide information about those as well. One of the things that we can do is provide information and assist with the interactive process. The interactive process, of course, is the process by which employers and employees, as well as other stakeholders, come together to decide on a course of action with regard to reasonable accommodation. A reasonable accommodation could be any type of change in the workplace or change in the way things are done in the workplace that is effective in allowing an individual with a disability to perform the essential functions of their job or have equal access to the benefits and privileges of employment. People often ask, what is reasonable when it comes to accommodation? reasonable on its face, i.e. ordinarily, or in the run of cases. You can read more about that in the EEOC's guidance document, Reasonable Accommodation and Undue Hardship under the ADA. Through the interactive process, employers and employees can explore options for accommodation and develop an accommodation plan. You can read more about the interactive process on the JAN website. JAN consultants also provide targeted technical assistance and comprehensive resources, and you can find information on a variety of disability-related topics on our website, which is askjan.org. If you do decide to contact us by phone or internet, please know that we will keep all information about your question and situation confidential. You can reach us by telephone at 1-800-526-7234. We also have a number of other ways that you can get in touch, including live chat through our website, texting, TTY and TTY relay service, video relay service, email, Skype, and a variety of social networks. If you missed the number, don't worry. You can find all of our contact information on the final slide of today's presentation. If you do decide to call us, you won't be alone in your decision. JAN receives 36,000 contacts per year and over 3 million web page requests per year. We also provide both live and archived training to many groups every year. You can read more about the training opportunities at the training link on the JAN website. Whether you are new to JAN or an old friend, I hope that you will give us the chance to work as your partner soon. Now let's talk about service animals and Title I of the ADA. Remember, Title I of the ADA works a little bit differently from the other titles. One key difference is that while employers are limited with regard to the types of medical questions they can ask, employers can often ask more questions about a person's service animal than other types of entities, like stores and doctor's offices. Also, due to recent changes in the regulations pertaining to Titles II and III of the ADA, certain types of animals are no longer considered service animals under these parts of the ADA. For parts of the ADA other than Title I, the definition of service animal is pretty much limited to dogs and miniature horses. Of course, there are some state laws that differ from the ADA in this respect. Some states consider any animal trained to perform a task to be a service animal under state law. In fact, I was recently asked about a service rat. This means that in some states, public entities may need to recognize other types of animals, but we're just focusing on the ADA today. Remember how I said that Title I is a little different? One of the biggest differences is that there is no specific definition of service animal under Title I. So, animals other than dogs and miniature horses may need to be allowed in the workplace, even though service animals are restricted to those types of species under other parts of the ADA. Part of the reason for this is that the Department of Justice, sometimes called the DOJ, writes the regulations pertaining to the parts of the ADA other than Title I, while the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or EEOC, is in charge of writing guidance documents pertaining to Title I. Sometimes the guidance from these two groups matches up pretty neatly, but in the case of service animals, there are differences. Another key point is that under Title I of the ADA, therapy or emotional support animals may be considered. An emotional support animal differs from other service animals by the passive nature of the type of assistance provided. An animal that actively provides support by performing tasks like alerting, interrupting, or retrieving medication might more properly be termed a service animal. Service animals to assist with personal needs may be considered as well. Employers sometimes get stuck on the fact that an accommodation request involves a service animal. Decisions about allowing service animals in the workplace can be handled similarly to other types of reasonable accommodation requests made under Title I of the ADA. This means that employees who want to bring their service animals to work need to be prepared to provide documentation about the reasons why the service animal is needed. Also, since employers can choose among effective accommodations, according to guidance from the EEOC, there may need to be a dialogue about potential alternative accommodation ideas. We will get into more detail about that in the later slides. My impression is that this group is pretty savvy and up to date. But when the general public thinks of service animals, the general impression is that they are mostly for people who are blind and use guide dogs for assistance in getting from place to place. However, the fact is that people with many types of impairments use service animals these days. Some typical types of impairments that are often associated with use of a service animal include motor impairments, vision impairments, hearing impairments, impairments involving functioning of the endocrine system such as diabetes and hypoglycemia, and mental health impairments. Next, let's talk about some typical tasks performed by service animals. Of course, service dogs are commonly used for mobility assistance by individuals who have low vision or who are blind. Individuals with motor impairments may use service animals for a variety of tasks, including assistance with balancing, while walking, or while transferring between a wheelchair and other types of seating, pulling a wheelchair, and carrying or retrieving items. I recently spoke with a service animal trainer who was teaching a dog how to retrieve a credit card from a bag and place it on the counter next to a register. That was a new one on me. Service animals can also be trained to alert individuals with disabilities to various situations and circumstances. For instance, a hearing dog might alert an individual who is deaf to the sound of an emergency alarm. A dog trained to assist an individual with a seizure disorder might alert the individual that a seizure is about to occur. Similarly, a dog trained to assist an individual with diabetes might be able to detect an upcoming hypoglycemic episode and alert the individual to take action. Sometimes the dog may even carry or retrieve items needed to deal with a medical emergency, such as medication or glucose tablets. In the case of newer types of service animals, such as hypoglycemic awareness animals, the individual and their dog often train together, and it is not unusual for a person's existing dog to be trained on how to detect and alert. Providing documentation on training can be challenging in these types of situations, but employers may ask for it, so be prepared. In the case of service animals trained to assist with mental health impairments, some typical tasks include calming the individual actively or passively, alerting them to the onset of a panic attack, and interrupting repetitive behaviors so that the individual can attempt to redirect themselves. Now let's talk about some typical accommodation issues involving service animals. I'm going to show you some examples based on actual accommodation scenarios that we've heard about here at JAN. One very typical type of workplace accommodation is called policy modification. In fact, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or EEOC, writes about how to modify a policy as a reasonable accommodation in one of its guidance documents called Reasonable Accommodation and Undue Hardship under the ADA. You can find a link to that document on the JAN website if you'd really like to read up on the subject. So what is policy modification? Basically, modifying a workplace policy is a form of reasonable accommodation that involves modifying a policy or the way a policy is applied for an individual with a disability. The policy only has to be modified for the employee with the disability. The employer may continue to apply the policy to all other employees. What does this mean for employees who use service animals? Well, a lot of employers have policies against bringing animals into the workplace. These policies prevent employees from bringing their pets to work. However, as we all know, service animals are not pets. They are working animals who are trained to do tasks. By modifying a policy against bringing animals into the workplace, an employer can choose to allow an employee to bring in a trained service animal that is needed because of disability, but still continue to prohibit other employees from bringing in other types of animals. Often, modifying policy is only the first step. An employee who is using a service animal may need additional accommodations beyond modification to a no-animal policy. A little later, we'll look at a variety of examples, including various accommodation approaches. I can't speak for everyone, but in my experience, once employers understand that modifying a policy doesn't mean that they have to change it for everyone, they often tend to be fairly open to this type of accommodation. Usually it is cost-free, and that is a good incentive for employers. Let's look at an example. A newly hired teacher with a seizure disorder used a service animal to alert her that a seizure was coming on. The school had a no-animal policy. The school allowed the teacher to bring her service animal to work and keep it with her in her classroom. She was also provided breaks to take the animal outside and given the opportunity to educate coworkers about the use of service animals. The employer reported that the accommodation cost nothing, and it was good for the students to see a service animal at work. Remember what I said before about medical documentation? In most situations, people who use service animals don't have to provide a lot of documentation to prove that the animal is a real service animal and that they need to use the animal for a disability-related reason. When someone is using a service animal as a member of the public, they usually get their protections from Titles 2 and 3 of the ADA, which strictly limit unnecessary medical inquiries. In some areas, there may be additional protections, under state and local laws as well. However, employees fall under Title 1 of the ADA. Under Title 1 of the ADA, requests to use a service animal at work are handled just like requests for other things like amplified telephones and ergonomic chairs. Employers are limited in the types of medical questions that they can ask, but not as limited as public entities under other parts of the ADA. Employers can ask the employee to provide documentation or demonstrate that an accommodation is needed when the disability or impairment is not obvious, that the service animal is trained, and that the service animal will not be disruptive. Speaking of which, if you hear a dog in the background, that's my buddy Russ. Please excuse him, he's still a puppy. Let's look at another example. An employee with post-traumatic stress disorder and anxiety worked in a call center. He requested to bring his service dog as a support animal because the disability was not obvious. The employer requested that the employee provide medical documentation to show that the dog was needed for this purpose. The employee provided a limited amount of medical information to the employer, along with a document from the agency that trained the dog. Reasonable accommodations when a coworker is allergic to a service animal. Well, if two employees both have ADA-covered conditions, then both employees need an effective accommodation, even though they may have competing needs. This topic comes up so frequently that we actually have a short publication on service animals and allergies. It's called Service Animals and Allergies in the Workplace, and you can find it on the JAN website on our comprehensive list of JAN publications, which you can find under the Publications and Resources link on our homepage. Of course, you can always call in as well. We would be happy to help you locate it. When it comes to accommodating employees who use service animals and employees who are allergic to service animals, some basic strategies include eliminating in-person contact and reducing the amount of in-person contact. Of course, there could be lots of ways to do that. Depending on the setting, it might involve moving offices around and relying a bit more on telephone and email, as opposed to face-to-face meetings. Making a change in the cleaning regimen at the workplace can make a big difference as well. If necessary, you can even purchase special products designed to reduce the allergenic effects of dander and saliva. If you'd like more information on those types of products, I hope that you will contact JAN. We have information on vendors of these types of items in our database. Let's look at another example involving an employee with a service animal and a coworker with an allergy. A newly hired federal employee requested to bring her service animal into the workplace. After starting, a coworker informed the employer of a severe allergy to animals. The employer moved one employee's workstation, provided an air purifier for the employee with an allergy, established separate routes of travel, maintained a regular cleaning schedule, and allowed the employees to communicate in alternative ways in place of face-to-face communication. I don't know exactly what alternate methods they used, but telephone, email, and instant messaging are typical methods of alternate communication that might be used in this type of situation. I don't have cost data on the scenario, but looking at it, there was probably a cost associated with the air purifier. Those can vary widely in cost depending on the quality of the air purifier and the size of the space in which it is being used. The type of setting can also make a big difference in how easy or difficult it is to get an employer to agree to admit a service animal. One particularly problematic type of setting tends to be food service. Food service establishments often have concerns about allowing an employee's service animal to enter the workplace. Many are surprised to learn that employers may not automatically reject a request to use a service animal as a reasonable accommodation in a restaurant or other food service area. Requests to use a service animal at work can be handled using the interactive process, and the overall accommodation process should be handled like requests for other types of accommodations. Let's look at an example. A prep cook with paraplegia was hired to work in a kitchen. He used a service animal to assist with personal needs and when commuting to and from work. His employer allowed the service animal to be present and provided a designated area for the dog to occupy until the employee needed assistance. The employer also allowed the employee to take periodic breaks to attend to the dog's basic daily needs. Medical facilities are another example of a setting where employers often have concerns about allowing a service animal. This is not surprising due to the number of regulations and guidelines involving infection control and sanitation with which such facilities must comply. Employers may be concerned with vaccinations, shot records, and general hygiene. Here is an example involving a hospital setting. A social worker with a vision impairment worked in a hospital and used a service animal. The employer was concerned about safety and hygiene issues that could impact patients and wanted to require that the employee provide the dog's shot records. A JAN consultant discussed the situation with the employer and how to approach the employee if there were concerns that the dog might be unhealthy. Next, let's talk a little bit about on-the-job travel with a service animal. On-the-job travel could mean travel across the country or travel across town. It can include any type of employer-sponsored travel, including travel between different offices or campuses controlled by the employer, travel to training, and travel to third-party locations, such as the offices of other businesses, or the homes of consumers or service recipients. Generally, on-the-job travel does not include travel to and from work. This is an important distinction because an employer's obligation to provide accommodations is different for on-the-job travel as opposed to travel to and from work. Basically, employers may have to consider additional accommodations for on-the-job travel that they would not necessarily have to consider for travel to and from work. This is a topic that gets a little beyond the scope of today's presentation, but if you do have questions about the general accommodation obligation regarding travel on the job and or commuting, I'd encourage you to contact the Job Accommodation Network directly. However, I am going to talk a little bit about how service animals fit into accommodations involving on-the-job travel. Traveling with an animal can be more complicated than traveling by oneself. For this reason, some individuals who use service animals may find it more convenient to use other methods like a cane or a sighted guide when traveling, and leave the dog at home or with a kenneling service. However, if you've ever been to a large disability-related conference such as CSUN or ATIA, then you know that many people do in fact travel with their service animals, and that those service animals come in many different shapes and sizes. I've only actually seen a miniature horse being used as a service animal in person one time, but I have seen all kinds of dogs and even a hearing cat. I will say that I've only ever seen service dogs used during travel by plane. I do think that it is beneficial for both employees with disabilities and their service animals to travel together when possible. Aside from the accommodation benefits, limiting the amount of time spent apart is just good for the human-animal bond. However, there can be challenges. One difficulty when traveling with a service animal is that one may face difficulties getting third-party locations to accept the presence of the animal. Also, there may be issues involving allergies or lack of a suitable service animal relief area. Let's look at an example involving a service animal and travel away from the office. An employee used a service animal for balance and had to travel away from the office to attend monthly meetings. She could not take the dog to some of the meetings because of coworkers with allergies. The employer was able to locate a dog care service that could care for the dog while she attended the meetings. The employer paid for this service as it was an added cost beyond what the employee would normally spend for care of her service animal. So far today, we've talked about basic differences between Title I of the ADA and other titles, and how to include a service animal in various settings. Next, I'd like to talk about some accommodation issues involving service animals that could occur in any setting. Many times, an employer may be willing and even enthusiastic about allowing a service animal to accompany an employee to work. But later they may realize that they didn't fully think it through, and that accommodations beyond simply allowing the animal are needed. It should come as no surprise that service animals, just like the rest of us, have certain basic daily needs related to activities of daily living. What I'm trying to say here is that service animals need to eat, drink, and go outside at appropriate intervals. It may be necessary to modify an employee's schedule to allow those things to happen and to make some decisions about where the animal will perform these activities of daily living. The location of a service animal relief area frequently becomes a point of contention. This is a point where all parties involved probably need to be prepared to have a dialogue and compromise. Employees also need to be prepared to take care of cleanup related to a service animal's basic needs. If there are employers listening, I also want you to know that the vast majority of employees who use service animals are very responsible service animal users and have almost always received training about how to deal with an animal's basic needs. However, there have been cases where employees and employers were unable to resolve sanitation issues, and eventually the employer asked that the animal stop coming to work. It can happen. Next, I'd like to say a few words about interacting with service animals. There are really two aspects to interacting with the service animal. On the one hand, the employee and the service animal need to have opportunities to maintain and support their human-animal bond. For this reason, many service animal users want to keep the animal with them as much as possible. As we talked about in the previous examples, there may be some situations where they need to be separated for some of the workday, but they also need some time together. Just as an aside, it may also be possible to find a way for an animal to enter a space safely and hygienically. I once took a call about a student with a service animal who needed to enter a human anatomy laboratory space. The student's school was concerned about the animal's safety in the space. Specifically, they were concerned that a student might drop a scalpel or other instrument, and that the dog would step on it and become injured. During the call, I discussed the possibility of creating a space for the animal to wait outside the lab. But I also provided information about protective footgear for dogs that might help to prevent this type of injury. When it comes to accommodation, a good rule of thumb is to be open to alternatives, and this is particularly true of accommodation scenarios involving service animals. Another accommodation issue involving interacting with service animals involves coworkers. There are a lot of people in this world who really love dogs and other animals and will naturally gravitate towards service animals. However, it is important to keep in mind that when a service animal is at work, and particularly when a service animal is wearing a harness, that dog is a working dog. Often employees may want to provide their coworkers with information and training about how to interact appropriately with a service animal who is working. When this happens, an employer might be involved with providing a time and place for this type of training to occur. Setting up a training can be a little tricky because of medical confidentiality issues, but I think it is well worth the effort. At a minimum, an employee with a service animal needs to know that the employer will back them up appropriately if problems with coworkers occur. Finally, service animals and their owners need training. With some of the newer types of service animals, such as seizure alert dogs and hypoglycemic awareness dogs, a person with a disability may train a dog who is already part of their family to perform certain tasks. This may or may not involve a trip to a training facility where they can work together under the supervision of a training team. When an individual is getting a service animal from an organization, they often need to travel to the organization's site and participate in an extended period of training in order to have an animal placed with them. Whether the travel is local or to a site far away, leave may be needed so that the individual and their animal can train together. Sometimes training may be needed after the initial placement as well. Or a person's service animal may retire, and they might need to attend training with their new animal. Let's look at another example. A newly hired receptionist who was blind requested to have breaks to care for her service animal. The employer allowed the employee to take periodic breaks and discussed providing general disability awareness training to the staff so that they knew how to interact appropriately with the service animal. We've come to the end of my prepared remarks, but I hope that you all have some questions and comments to share. As I said before, service animals are a favorite topic of mine, and I'm very interested in your questions. While we're waiting for some questions to come in, I'd also like to tell you how you can reach the Accommodation Network. You can find information about service animals on our website at the link that's being pasted into the chat window. You can find lots of other information on our website, which is askjan.org. But sometimes it's nice to bounce ideas off another person. Jan Consultants can be reached Monday to Friday, 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. You can reach us by phone at 800-526-7234. That is our voice line, but you can also use it for relay calls. If you'd like to contact us via TTY directly, you can do that at 877-781-9403. You can also email us at jan@askjan.org. Reach us by text at 304-216-8189. Contact us via Skype using the name Jan Consultants, and chat with us online at askjan.org. Now let's get to your questions.
This is Jan. I have a question. I thought it was really interesting when you were comparing the need of a person who uses a service dog versus the needs of the person that are allergic to dog. Is there a way to determine whose needs take precedence if both of them can't be accommodated? I mean, like in classrooms and schools, if there's one child in the classroom who's allergic to dogs, then nobody gets to bring a pet dog into the classroom for Show Pet Day. But what if there's a child in the same class who needs a service dog? I mean, there's one that's allergic, there's one who needs the dog. Whose needs take precedence?
It's interesting that you would bring that up, because there is a case like that is working its way through the courts right now. I think it's very hard to decide whose needs take precedence. In some cases, a decision is made to separate the person with allergies from the person with the service animal entirely. But it's definitely a difficult situation. I think we'll have a better idea of how to deal with these types of situations as cases work their way through the court system. But in general, if two people have ADA-covered disabilities, then both of their needs need to be addressed. Although I realize that in practice that can be quite difficult. I really don't know of a formula for deciding whose disability takes precedence. Everything in the ADA is case by case. I hope that helps.
Jan, do you need help scrolling up and finding the questions, or are you doing okay on that?
Okay, I see another question. When someone who uses paratransit has severe allergies, should they include that as part of their file with the paratransit service so that they are not booked on a ride with a service animal? You know, I really think that they should. If it's important that they avoid certain types of animals, then it's vital that paratransit have that information available. I don't know how they can accommodate if they don't have the information. Okay, I see another question. Does Jan assist individuals outside the U.S.? As far as assisting individuals outside of the U.S., we are able to provide information on accommodation ideas and to help with problem-solving accommodation solutions. However, we don't provide information on technical assistance about laws outside the U.S. So here's another question. In a business setting, can employers be reimbursed for providing accommodations? Is there a grant or program established for this? We do have a link with information on tax incentives on our website. That's usually the first place that I suggest checking. Okay, a bit about service mini horses. What can they do? The miniature service animal horses actually perform tasks very similar to dogs. There are miniature horses that do guiding type activities, but I've also heard of them being used for people with motor disabilities who need assistance pulling a wheelchair or balancing. Those horses are very intelligent, and they can be trained to do a variety of tasks. They are most typically used by individuals who have severe allergies to dogs or who cannot use dogs for other cultural reasons. Someone has asked cultural reasons. What do you mean? In some cultures, it's not acceptable to have a dog inside the home, and a service animal really needs to be able to come inside the home to have a good human-animal bond. In those cultures, it may be more common to use a miniature horse as opposed to a dog for service-related tasks. There was a question about funding-related challenges for individuals seeking accommodation from nonprofits. Of course, nonprofits don't have the tax incentive resources that businesses have. This is a tough one, but I always encourage nonprofits to see if there are any additional funding streams that they can explore. For example, sometimes if an employee is also a client of vocational rehabilitation, that agency may have some flexibility to help. I would also suggest contacting Jan to see if there are very low cost or no cost accommodations that could be effective. Another good resource is the state AT project in your state. They sometimes have information about second-hand equipment and funding streams that are local to a particular region. If you are in that situation, I would really encourage you to call Jan directly. When we're in the office and have all of our resources available, we might be able to help you find something a little more easily. Any other questions? I have a comment about a case involving a student denied his service dog by his school because of mood issues. I don't know that particular case. Okay, there's a question about service dogs in training. That's something where you can read more about it in Jan's article on service animals in the workplace. To an extent, there can be differences from state to state because of differences in state laws. But basically, Under the ADA, only employees with disabilities are entitled to reasonable accommodations. So if an employee without a disability is training a service animal for someone else, there would not be an obligation under Title I of the ADA. I encourage you to check out our article for more complete information on that. If you do have questions that we didn't get to today, please feel free to contact us. You can do that either via the methods that we mentioned or by sending an IM in Second Life. Thanks for having us.
I'm going to take this opportunity for thanking Teresa and her Jan buddies. I think there must be more than 2 hands working on this project. And if I ever get to have a service dog, I think I'm going to be better prepared now to explain his or her presence. I definitely want to thank the audience, the very enthusiastic participation in this topic. That is wonderful. Please be sure to tell the world what you learned. You can do that on our blog at blog.virtualability.org. Again, I want to thank iSky for setting this all up. She did all the hard work. And we've had Lady Slipper and Kara, who've been working most of the day today. I think Kara's going to have very sore legs when she's done. They've been doing all the greeting of the people who are coming in. And of course, I want to thank and mention Metaverse TV and Dusa Dragonesh. They are filming today's events. They are streaming these projects live, these presentations live, and they're also going to archive this so that we'll be able to come back and look at this information later. You can tell your friends that they can see you on live stream. So thank you, everyone. And we have one more presentation coming up. There's a panel coming up at 5:30, an international panel. That'll be fun. Thank you all.